Before writing appeared, and before metal ruled the world, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was already building upward. At dawn the plain is flat and wide, broken only by a stepped mountain made by human hands. A ziggurat does not hide. It announces itself. From miles away, it dominates the horizon, a solid geometry against sky and dust. For generations, people have looked at these forms and asked the same question. Were they only temples, or were they meant to do something more? Ziggurats begin appearing in southern Mesopotamia around the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. This is the same period when cities like Uruk, Ur, and Eridu were forming permanent urban centers. Writing was just emerging. Kingship was taking shape. Religion, economy, and government were not separate systems yet. They were one structure, layered together, much like the buildings themselves. The ziggurat rose at the center of this system, not as a mystery machine, but as the highest point of human order in a flat and unpredictable land. From the ground up, these structures were built from mud brick, the most common material available in the river valleys. Stone was rare, wood was limited, clay and water were abundant. Builders shaped millions of bricks by hand, dried them in the sun, and stacked them into massive platforms. The outer faces were often reinforced with fired brick and bitumen to resist rain. The form was practical, heavy, and grounded. Nothing about it suggests lightness or mobility. Everything about it suggests permanence and visibility. The ziggurat was never meant to be entered like a modern building. There were no large interior halls and no public rooms inside the mass. Instead, the structure lifted a temple shrine high above the city. The god did not come down. People looked up. Height mattered. In a land where floods erased boundaries and horizons stretched without limit, height was power made visible. To stand above the plain was to stand closer to the divine order that governed crops, seasons, and survival. The question of signal towers comes much later, born in a modern world. Ancient Mesopotamians did not think in those terms. Their texts speak of gods descending, not machines landing. Their building records describe offerings, dedications, and restoration work, not devices or energy. When kings rebuilt ziggurats, they recorded their devotion and their legitimacy, placing their names into brick so future generations would know who restored the bond between heaven and earth. This chapter begins with the shape itself, because the shape tells us where to look. A ziggurat is not hidden technology, it is exposed belief. It is geometry meant to be seen by everyone who worked the fields, paid temple dues, and feared the gods that controlled rain and harvest. Before asking what these structures could do, we must understand what they were designed to say. They spoke in mass, height, and labor. Their signal was not sent upward into space. It was sent outward, across the plain, alone. The idea that ziggurats were Anunnaki signal towers refuses to fade, not because of new evidence, but because it feels powerful. It offers a modern answer to an ancient question. It suggests that the first cities were guided by advanced beings, that the gods of Mesopotamia were not symbols but visitors, and that the massive towers rising above the plains were built to communicate with them. If this were true, it would not be a small correction to history. It would rewrite the entire story of early civilization. This claim begins appearing widely in the 20th century, especially after the middle of the century, when space travel, radio communication, and satellite technology reshaped how humans imagined contact across distance. Ancient structures were reinterpreted through modern expectations. Height became assumed function. Platforms became assumed launch points. Gods became assumed astronauts. The Anunnaki, a group of deities named in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, were removed from their cultural setting and redefined as non-human engineers visiting Earth. If ziggurats were signal towers, certain things would have to be true. The builders would need knowledge of transmission, reception, or guidance beyond simple visibility. The structures would require materials capable of handling energy, heat, or vibration. There would need to be internal systems, channels, or components supporting a function beyond ritual display. There would also need to be written or material evidence showing that Mesopotamians understood these structures as tools rather than sacred places. None of these conditions are supported by archaeology. Excavated ziggurats show solid mud brick cores with no internal chambers or conduits. Their stairways are ceremonial, not mechanical. Their upper platforms held small temples, not equipment. The materials used are fragile by modern standards, vulnerable to water and erosion, and unsuitable for sustained technological use. Even maintenance records focus on repairing weather damage, not restoring devices. Texts provide further clarity. When kings describe ziggurats, they speak of pleasing the gods, restoring cosmic order, and honoring divine names. They do not describe functions, signals, or operations. The Anunnaki themselves are not portrayed as inventors or builders of machines. They are judges, ancestors, and divine authorities within a mythic system that explains fate, law, and nature. The persistence of this idea reveals more about the modern world than the ancient one. It reflects discomfort with the idea that early humans organized massive projects through belief, labor, and social structure alone. Accepting the signal tower claim requires rejecting mountains of physical and textual evidence. Examining it carefully allows us to ask a better question. Not whether ziggurats contacted the Anunnaki, but why we want them to have. The claim survives because mystery sells, and complexity is harder to market than wonder. But history does not need visitors from the sky to be impressive. The real achievement lies in what these societies built, with limited tools, shared belief, and organized effort. Understanding that truth is more challenging and far more human than any signal sent to the stars. That is where the real investigation begins now. Ziggurats did not appear suddenly as finished monuments. They evolved slowly, step by step, alongside the rise of cities themselves. Long before the first true ziggurat rose above the Mesopotamian plain, temples already occupied raised platforms. These early platforms appear as early as the 6th millennium before the Common Era at sites like Eridu. They were simple, low mounds made of packed earth and mud brick, lifting sacred space above ordinary ground. The idea was not height for technology, but separation. Sacred space was elevated to mark it as different from daily life. As settlements grew into cities during the 4th millennium before the Common Era, these platforms grew with them. Uruk, one of the earliest true cities, shows clear stages of architectural expansion. Temples were rebuilt again and again on the same spot. Each rebuilding added height, not because of ambition alone, but because rebuilding on top of older structures was easier than clearing them away. Over time, the temple mound became taller and more formal. What began as a practical solution became a symbolic one. By the early dynastic period, roughly the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, stepped platforms became intentional designs. Builders were no longer simply stacking remains. They were shaping terraces, aligning stairways, and emphasizing vertical movement. These early ziggurat forms still supported temples on top. The sacred focus remained the shrine, not the mass beneath it. The structure below existed to lift the god closer to the sky and to make the god visible to the city. During the Akkadian period, and especially under the 3rd dynasty of Ur, in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, ziggurats reached their classic form. Kings like Namu, and Shulgi standardized the design. Massive rectangular bases, multiple stepped levels, monumental staircases leading upward, fired brick facings sealed with bitumen to protect against rain, inscriptions naming the king, the god, and the act of restoration. These were state projects, organized and funded by centralized authority. The Babylonian period continued this tradition rather than reinventing it. Later rulers rebuilt older ziggurats to show continuity with the past. Each rebuilding reinforced legitimacy. To restore a ziggurat was to restore order itself. The structure linked the king, the god, and the city into a single visible statement that continuity matters. It shows that ziggurats belong to a clear architectural lineage, not a sudden leap inspired by outside forces. Across Sumer, Akkad, and Babylonia, the pattern remains consistent. Ziggurats rise where cities are dense, temple economies are strong, and kings need public symbols of authority. They do not appear in isolation, they do not appear in rural zones, they do not vary wildly in function. Their evolution follows social complexity, not technological mystery. Understanding where ziggurats come from strips away the illusion of sudden invention. These structures are the result of centuries of building, rebuilding, and belief layered into brick. They are not anomalies. They are conclusions. When viewed in sequence, the ziggurat is not a question mark in history. It is an answer shaped slowly by human hands, responding to religion, politics, and the need to make power visible in a flat world. A ziggurat is not a mystery object once its structure is understood. It is a massive raised platform built in layers, designed to lift a temple above the city and protect it from water, time, and human traffic. At its core, a ziggurat is solid. There are no hollow chambers hidden inside. Excavations across Mesopotamia show the same basic method, repeated again and again. Builders used sun-dried mud brick to form the heart of the structure because clay was abundant and easy to shape. Millions of bricks were stacked tightly, creating enormous weight and stability. This core was never meant to be seen. It was meant to hold everything above it in place. To protect that fragile interior, the outer surfaces were faced with baked brick. These bricks were fired in kilns and sealed with bitumen, a natural asphalt that resisted water. Rain was the greatest enemy of these structures. Without protection, mud brick dissolves. The baked brick skin acted like armor, slowing erosion and extending the life of the monument. When this outer layer failed, kings rebuilt it, often leaving inscriptions that describe repair, not innovation. Maintenance was constant because the environment demanded it. The step design served several purposes at once. Each terrace reduced the load placed on the level below, spreading weight outward rather than downward. This made the structure more stable over time. Terraces also created visual rhythm. From a distance, the steps emphasized height and order. The building looked intentional, controlled, and permanent. That mattered in cities where floods could erase streets and fields overnight. The ziggurat stood firm when everything else vanished. Stairways are one of the most recognizable features. They are wide, ceremonial, and exposed. Their placement directs movement upward in a controlled way. At sites like 3 stairways converge at a gate before the upper levels. This design limits access. Not everyone climbed to the top. The stairs were not for daily traffic. They were for ritual moments, processions, and official acts. Their scale communicates importance, not speed or efficiency. Drainage systems reveal even more about purpose. Channels and weep holes were built into terraces to carry rainwater away from the structure. This detail shows practical knowledge of weather and material limits. Builders understood that water had to be guided off the surface or the entire monument would fail. These drains are small, simple, and effective. They are not conduits for energy or signals. They are solutions to rain. At the summit sat a temple shrine. This was the sacred destination. The shrine was modest compared to the mass beneath it. It housed the gods symbolically, not physically. Offerings were brought there. Rituals were performed. The god was believed to descend to the shrine, not to live permanently inside it. Everything below existed to elevate that space. When each architectural feature is examined closely, the picture becomes clear. Ziggurats are designed to endure, to be seen, and to separate sacred space from ordinary ground. Their materials are heavy, their systems are simple, and their function is consistent. Nothing about their construction suggests hidden machinery. Everything about it reflects human planning, environmental adaptation, and religious intent. A ziggurat never stood alone. It was part of a dense urban landscape where religion, economy, and power were fused into one system. To understand what these structures meant, they must be placed back inside the cities that built them. In Mesopotamia, cities were not just places where people lived. They were sacred territories owned by gods. Each major city belonged to a specific deity, and the city existed to serve that divine patron. The ziggurat rose at the center as the visible anchor of that relationship. Around the ziggurat spread a temple complex. This included courtyards, storage rooms, workshops, offices, and housing for priests and administrators. These were not quiet spiritual spaces. They were busy centers of activity. Grain was collected and redistributed. Textiles were produced. Livestock was managed. Records were written and stored. The temple oversaw land, labor, and goods. In many cities, it functioned as the largest economic institution long before palaces took on that role. The high place mattered because it organized space both physically and socially. The god was placed above the city, literally and symbolically. The people lived below. Access upward was restricted. Priests moved between levels. Officials worked in the complex. Ordinary citizens interacted with the temple through offerings, labor obligations, and festivals. The ziggurat made hierarchy visible. Everyone could see where they stood in relation to divine authority. Rituals tied the structure to time as well as space. Seasonal festivals involved processions that moved toward the temple. Music, offerings, and public ceremonies reinforced the bond between city and god. When floods came or harvests failed, the temple was where the city sought answers. When kings ruled, they did so with divine approval displayed through building and rebuilding sacred structures. To restore a ziggurat was to show that order had been repaired. Administration and belief were inseparable. The same institution that organized prayer also organized work. Written tablets record rations issued to workers, land leased to farmers, and goods stored for future use. These records come from temple archives, not from hidden chambers or secret rooms. The power of the ziggurat was not mystery. It was visibility. It stood high so everyone could see that the system was watching and enduring. Ideology lived in brick. The size of the structure reflected the strength of the city and the favor of its god. When cities competed, they did so with monuments. A taller or newly restored ziggurat signaled prosperity and legitimacy. This is why later kings rebuilt older structures rather than abandoning them. Continuity mattered more than novelty. The past gave authority to the present. Seen this way, the ziggurat is not an isolated puzzle. It is the peak of an urban machine designed to manage belief, labor, and loyalty. Its height was not for sending messages outward. It was for shaping behavior inward. The house on the hill told every person below who protected the city, who owned the land, and where power ultimately came from. In that message, nothing was hidden. It was written in scale, stone, and daily life. The Anunnaki were never described as visitors from the stars by the people who worshipped them. In Mesopotamian texts, they are gods, part of a complex divine hierarchy that govern nature, fate, and human society. The word Anunnaki comes from Sumerian roots and can be translated roughly as the offspring of An, or those of royal seed. An was the sky god, a figure of authority rather than motion or travel. From the beginning, the Anunnaki are defined by status, not by technology. In the earliest Sumerian sources from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the Anunnaki appear as a collective group of powerful deities associated with judgment and order. They are not consistently individualized. Instead, they function as an assembly. In myths and hymns, they gather to decide destinies, approve kingship, and uphold cosmic balance. Their authority is legal and moral. They do not build cities. They do not design machines. Humans build temples for them as acts of devotion. As languages and cultures shift from Sumerian to Akkadian, the role of the Anunnaki shifts as well. In Akkadian texts, especially those dealing with the underworld, the Anunnaki are sometimes described as chthonic gods who rule below the earth. This change reflects evolving religious ideas, not new beings. Mesopotamian religion was not fixed. Gods changed roles, merged identities, and gained or lost importance over time. That flexibility is well documented in tablets and inscriptions. What never appears in any primary source is the idea that the Anunnaki arrived from space, needed assistance, or relied on human-built technology. No text describes them teaching, engineering, astronomy beyond ritual calendars or advanced science. When gods descend, it is symbolic and temporary. They travel between realms as divine beings, not physical explorers. The language used is poetic and religious, not technical. Modern interpretations often depend on mistranslation or selective reading. Words associated with heaven are taken literally rather than cosmologically. Descriptions of brightness or power are treated as physical effects rather than metaphors. In reality, ancient writers used vivid language to convey authority and awe. Fire, light, and height were common symbols of divine presence across many cultures. They do not imply machinery. The Anunnaki were also not central to everyday worship in the way modern retellings suggest. City gods like Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and Marduk dominated ritual life. The Anunnaki appear mainly in literary and theological contexts. They represent the structure of divine law, not daily interaction. Temples were built for specific gods, not for the Anunnaki as a group. Understanding who the Anunnaki were requires reading the texts as their authors intended. These were religious explanations for how the world worked, who had authority, and why kings ruled. They answered questions about justice, fate, and survival in a harsh environment. Recasting these gods as aliens removes them from their cultural setting and replaces meaning with spectacle. The Anunnaki were gods because that was how Mesopotamians understood power. They were not misunderstood engineers or forgotten astronauts. They were symbols of order in a world shaped by floods, droughts, and uncertainty. Treating them as aliens does not add depth to history. It flattens it. The real story is richer when the Anunnaki are allowed to be what the texts say they are. Divine figures woven into the human effort to explain existence itself. Ancient writers did not describe the universe as a machine. They described it as a layered order, where heaven and earth were parts of a living system governed by divine law. In Mesopotamian thought, heaven was not outer space. It was a realm of authority, permanence, and control. Earth was the human domain, unstable and vulnerable. Between them existed a relationship that had to be maintained through ritual, obedience, and correct behavior. Language about heaven and earth expressed balance, not distance. When Sumerian and Akkadian texts speak of gods descending from heaven, they are not describing travel through physical space. They are describing moments when divine will touches human affairs. Heaven was understood as above in status, not above in altitude. The sky mattered because it delivered rain, storms, and signs. Looking upward was about dependence, not exploration. The heavens were unpredictable, powerful, and beyond human control, which is why they became the symbolic home of gods. Cosmic order was expressed through metaphor because metaphor was the language available. Ancient writers did not have technical vocabulary for abstract systems. They used images drawn from daily life. Kingship mirrored divine rule. Law mirrored cosmic judgment. Temples mirrored mountains. When a text describes a god seated high above, it is explaining authority in a visual way that everyone could understand. Height meant power. Stillness meant permanence. Light meant favor. Modern readers often mistake this symbolic language for literal description because modern culture is trained to think in mechanical terms. We live in a world of satellites, engines, and signals. When we see words like heaven, ascent, or descent, we imagine motion and technology. Ancient people did not. They imagined order being established or disrupted. A god arriving meant a change in fate, not a change in location. Ziggurats were named using this same symbolic logic. Some were called foundations of heaven and earth. This phrase did not mean they connected two physical places. It meant they anchored cosmic order within the city. The building stood where divine authority met human responsibility. The god was honored above. The people worked below. The structure marked that boundary clearly. Texts also describe the universe as having levels: the sky, the land, the underworld. These were not mapped spaces. They were moral and functional zones. The underworld explained death. The sky explained power. Earth explained struggle. Gods moved between these zones because they embodied forces that shaped all of them. Humans did not follow because humans belonged only to one layer. When metaphors are read as blueprints, meaning collapses, poetic descriptions become misunderstood as technical instructions. That misunderstanding fuels ideas about machines, signals, and visitors. But nothing in the texts supports that reading. No measurements, no materials, no procedures, only values, authority, and fear of disorder. Understanding ancient language requires stepping out of modern habits. It means accepting that not every description is literal. Heaven and earth were ideas before they were places. Ziggurats did not reach upward to send messages. They stood still to remind people of where they belonged. When read in context, the words are clear. The confusion begins only when modern expectations are imposed on ancient thought. To understand whether ziggurats functioned as signal towers, it is necessary to understand what signaling actually meant in the Bronze Age. Communication across distance existed, but it was limited, visible, and simple. There was no radio, no electricity, and no concept of invisible transmission. Signals were physical and short range. They relied on human sight, sound, and movement. Any claim that ancient structures served as advanced signal devices must first pass this basic reality. The most common long-distance signals in the ancient world were fires and smoke. Beacons were used to warn of danger or announce arrivals. These systems required clear lines of sight between points and were usually placed on hills, walls, or towers designed specifically for that purpose. They were small, accessible, and often temporary. Archaeology can identify such sites because they leave traces of repeated burning, ash layers, and simple platforms built for watch duty. Sound was another method. Drums, horns, and bells could carry messages across short distances, especially in open terrain. These signals were loud but limited. They worked for alerts, not complex information. Written communication relied on messengers traveling by foot, animal, or boat. Clay tablets were sealed, carried, and delivered by hand. Speed depended on roads, rivers, and organization, not height. If ziggurats were signal towers, they would need to show evidence of these uses. There would be platforms designed for fire pits or smoke generation. There would be repeated burn marks at the summit. There would be guard access and functional stair use. There would be alignment between multiple towers forming a network. None of this is found. Ziggurat stairways are ceremonial, not practical for constant traffic. Their summits are occupied by temples, not open signaling platforms. More importantly, ziggurats were not positioned to optimize communication. They sit inside cities, surrounded by buildings, walls, and activity. True signal towers are placed on ridges, borders, or coastlines where visibility matters most. Ziggurats prioritize centrality over range. Their purpose was to be seen by the city itself, not to see beyond it. Material evidence also matters. Fire signaling requires constant fuel and maintenance. This leaves residue. Archaeological layers at ziggurat tops show ritual debris, offerings, and temple furnishings, not ash pits or signal equipment. Texts describing ziggurats focus on gods receiving offerings, not watchers scanning horizons. When ancient texts describe signaling, they are explicit. They mention fires, horns, and messengers directly. They never describe ziggurats in this way. The idea of advanced signaling assumes knowledge that did not exist. It projects modern systems backward without evidence. Bronze Age societies solved communication problems with tools they understood and controlled. Their solutions were visible, repeatable, and documented. Ziggurats do not match those patterns. What they do match is symbolic communication. They broadcast meaning, not messages. Their height told people where power lived. Their mass showed stability. Their presence reassured citizens that the gods were honored and the city was protected. That is a form of signaling, but it is social, not technological. When the question is framed correctly, the answer becomes clear. Ziggurats did not transmit signals because the world that built them had no use for such devices. What it needed were monuments that organized belief, authority, and labor in one visible form. That was the signal they were built to send, and it was received by everyone who lived beneath them. Height has always spoken to humans before a single word is heard. In a flat landscape like southern Mesopotamia, height becomes impossible to ignore. The ziggurat rose above homes, workshops, fields, and walls, not by accident, but by intention. Its elevation was a message written in brick. Power lives here. Order lives here. Protection lives here. This was not abstract. Every person in the city could see it every day, and that visibility shaped belief as effectively as any spoken rule. Temple towers worked because humans instinctively associate height with authority. This is not unique to Mesopotamia. Mountains, thrones, towers, and raised seats appear across cultures for the same reason. Height separates. It removes what is elevated from ordinary reach. In Mesopotamian cities, the ziggurat created a permanent hierarchy in physical form. The god was placed above. The priest mediated below. The people remained on the ground. That structure did not need explanation. It was visible. Permanence mattered just as much. Ziggurats were massive, not only to impress, but to endure. Building one required enormous labor, organized resources, and long-term planning. That alone communicated wealth and stability. A city capable of maintaining such a structure signaled that it could also defend itself, feed its people, and enforce law. When floods destroyed houses and fields, the ziggurat remained. Survival reinforced belief. The god had not abandoned the city. Wealth was encoded into scale. Every baked brick, every layer of bitumen, every rebuilt terrace represented stored labor and surplus. Temples controlled land and goods, and the ziggurat was the visual summary of that control. Visitors arriving from outside the city did not need to read tablets to understand who held power. The tower told them. This city had a god. This god had resources. This city was not weak. The bond between city and deity was the most important message of all. Mesopotamian religion was local. Each city belonged to a specific god. The ziggurat was that relationship made visible. It was not a general monument. It was a claim. This god dwells here. This land is under their protection. When kings rebuilt ziggurats, they were not inventing new meanings. They were renewing old ones. Restoration was political and religious at the same time. Height also controlled movement and behavior. Access upward was limited. Only certain people could climb during certain moments. That restriction reinforced status. Festivals made the tower a focus of collective attention, while daily life kept it distant. People did not live inside it. They oriented themselves around it. The ziggurat structured the city mentally as much as physically. This is how height functions, as a signal without technology. It does not transmit information. It imposes meaning. The message is constant and unavoidable. Authority is above you. Order is stable. The system is larger than any individual. That message does not require devices or mechanisms. It requires belief reinforced by stone. When modern observers search for signals aimed outward, they miss the signal aimed inward. Ziggurats were built to communicate with people, not with the sky. Their power lies in how they shaped thought, loyalty, and fear through presence alone. That is why they were rebuilt again and again. The signal worked, and everyone could read it. The Ziggurat of Ur is one of the best preserved and most studied examples of these structures, which makes it a clear test case for understanding purpose. It was first built during the reign of Ur-Nammu, king of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around the late 21st century before the Common Era. His son Shulgi completed and expanded it. From the beginning, the ziggurat was dedicated to Nana, the moon god, and patron deity of the city. Its purpose was stated plainly in inscriptions. It was built to honor the god and secure divine favor for the city. The structure sits within a larger sacred precinct, not on an isolated hill or boundary. This matters. It places the ziggurat at the heart of urban religious life, rather than at the edge for observation or communication. The base is rectangular and massive, built from a solid mud brick core faced with baked brick. The size is overwhelming, but the design is simple and repetitive. This is architecture meant to last, not to function dynamically. One of the most striking features is the stairway system. 3 monumental staircases rise from the ground level. 2 side stairs and 1 central stair converge at a gate partway up the structure. This convergence point is critical. It creates a moment of control. Movement upward is narrowed and regulated. Above that point, access becomes more restricted. This design fits ritual procession perfectly. It does not fit constant traffic or mechanical use. At the top stood a temple shrine, now lost but described in texts. This shrine was the focus of worship. Offerings were brought there. Priests performed rituals. The god was believed to descend temporarily to receive them. The shrine was small compared to the platform beneath it. This tells us that the goal was not activity at the summit, but sanctity. The mass below existed to elevate and protect that sacred space. The rebuilding history reinforces this interpretation. The Ziggurat of Ur was restored multiple times over centuries. Kings from later periods repaired the outer brickwork, resealed surfaces, and rebuilt stairways. In the 6th century before the Common Era, the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus restored it again. His inscriptions praise the ancient builders and the god. He does not describe improving function. He describes renewing devotion. Excavations reveal no evidence of signaling equipment. There are no fire pits on the summit, no ash layers from repeated burning, no metal fittings, no conduits or channels beyond drainage. What archaeologists do find are offering remains, foundation deposits, and ritual objects consistent with temple use. The layout directs attention inward and upward, not outward across the landscape. The Ziggurat of Ur also sits within a dense city of houses, streets, and walls. Its visibility is aimed at residents, not distant points. A signal tower meant to communicate across long distances would be placed differently and built differently. Ur's ziggurat prioritizes ceremony, hierarchy, and presence. When examined closely, every feature aligns with cult practice. The builders, the stairways, the controlled access, the shrine, and the long history of ritual restoration all point in the same direction. This is not a machine waiting to be decoded. It is a religious monument doing exactly what it was built to do. It lifted the god above the city and reminded everyone below who ruled the world they lived in. Uruk offers one of the clearest views into how ziggurats functioned inside living cities because its sacred district was not separate from government or economy. The Iana district of Uruk developed over centuries, beginning in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, and remained active long after. It was dedicated primarily to the goddess Inanna, a deity tied to fertility, warfare, and political power. The architecture here shows how sacred space and state authority became inseparable. The Iana district was not a single building. It was a complex of temples, courtyards, storage rooms, workshops, and administrative areas organized around raised platforms and later ziggurat-like structures. These buildings controlled land, labor, and goods. Thousands of clay tablets found at Uruk record rations, worker assignments, textile production, and grain storage. This was not symbolic power alone. It was operational power. Festivals tied the population to this system. During major religious events, processions moved through the city toward the sacred precinct. Music, offerings, and ritual performances reinforced shared identity. The goddess was honored, but the city itself was unified. These events were planned, funded, and managed by temple officials. Religion created rhythm in civic life. Architecture provided the stage. The raised platforms in the Aana district show a clear developmental path toward later ziggurats. Each rebuilding episode expanded size and complexity. Temples were elevated higher with each phase. This elevation did not improve communication or visibility beyond the city. It structured authority within it. Those who controlled access controlled legitimacy. Uruk also demonstrates how writing emerged from temple needs. The earliest cuneiform tablets were accounting records. They tracked offerings, labor, and inventory. Writing was born to manage temple economies. The sacred and the practical grew together. When ziggurats later rose, they stood above systems that were already deeply bureaucratic. Political authority relied on this structure. Early kings of Uruk did not rule apart from the temple, they ruled through it. Building projects were religious acts and political statements at the same time. To expand or restore sacred architecture was to claim divine approval. The ziggurat form concentrated that message into a single dominant shape. Nothing in the Aana district suggests hidden technology or external communication. Everything points inward toward control, organization, and display. The buildings face courtyards, not horizons. Storage rooms cluster near temples, not towers. Pathways guide processions, not signals. The architecture supports human movement, administration, and ritual repetition. Uruk matters because it shows the system working at scale. Sacred architecture did not exist for mystery, it existed for management. The gods legitimized authority. The temples organized resources. The buildings made it visible. When later ziggurats rose higher, they were not inventing new purposes. They were amplifying an existing one. In Uruk, sacred architecture and statecraft became one system long before later myths formed. The ziggurat did not stand above society, it grew out of it. Understanding this removes the need for speculation. The power on display was human organization under divine symbols. That fusion built cities and kept them running for centuries. Ziggurats speak for themselves because their builders made sure they would. Across Mesopotamia, kings placed inscriptions directly into bricks, foundations, and walls, leaving clear records of why these monuments were built. These were not hidden texts meant for priests alone. They were public statements sealed into the structure itself, meant to last as long as the building stood. When these inscriptions are read, they remove much of the mystery that later generations try to add. Royal building inscriptions follow a consistent pattern. The king names himself, names his father, names the god of the city, and describes the act of construction or restoration. He explains that the god commanded or approved the work. He states that he rebuilt what time had damaged. He asks future rulers to respect the monument and future gods to grant blessings. This formula appears again and again from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era onward. The message is stability, devotion, and legitimacy. At Ur, bricks stamped with the name of Ur-Nammu declare that he built the ziggurat for Nana, his beloved god. At Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar II records his work on Etemenanki, emphasizing that he strengthened its foundations and raised its height to honor Marduk. At Uruk, kings restore temples to Inanna and record their piety in brick. These texts are not vague, they are direct. They do not describe devices, signals, or functions beyond worship and order. The act of inscribing bricks itself mattered. Each brick carried the king's name into the building. Millions of bricks meant millions of repetitions of authority. Labourers laid them one by one, embedding royal identity into the monument. The structure became a permanent reminder of who ruled and why. Even when later kings rebuilt ziggurats, they often preserved earlier inscriptions, showing respect for continuity rather than innovation. These records also reveal how kings understood their role. They did not claim to invent ziggurats. They claimed to restore them. Restoration was a sacred duty. A damaged ziggurat meant cosmic imbalance. Repairing it meant renewing the bond between heaven and earth. This belief is stated openly in texts. Kings feared divine anger more than public opinion. Their building projects were acts of insurance against chaos. Importantly, inscriptions never describe how a ziggurat works in a technical sense. There are no instructions, no diagrams, no references to internal systems. When construction details appear, they focus on materials, bricks, bitumen, and labour. The concern is durability, not function beyond ritual. This absence matters. Ancient builders recorded what they thought was important. If ziggurats served advanced purposes, that would appear somewhere. It does not. These texts also show that meaning was controlled. Kings wanted people to believe that the gods favoured their rule. Building large sacred monuments made that belief visible. Inscriptions ensured that the message would survive even if memory faded. The bricks speak because they were designed to. When later readers ignore these voices, they replace ancient intentions with modern imagination. The bricks already tell us why ziggurats were built. They honour gods. They legitimize kings. They anchor cities in cosmic order. Listening to them does not reduce wonder. It clarifies it. The real achievement is not hidden technology, but the ability of early states to turn belief, labour, and architecture into lasting power, written literally into stone and clay. The temple was the economic heart of Mesopotamian cities, long before markets and palaces took over that role. To understand ziggurats, they must be seen as the visible peak of a system that organised land, labour, and survival. Temples did not exist only to receive prayers. They managed resources on a scale that made cities possible in an unstable environment shaped by floods and droughts. Temple institutions controlled large areas of farmland. Fields technically belonged to the god, not to individuals. Farmers worked temple land in exchange for protection, tools, seed, and a share of the harvest. Surplus grain flowed back into temple storehouses, where it could be redistributed during lean seasons. This system reduced risk. When floods failed or crops suffered, the temple could feed workers and prevent collapse. That practical role gave religious authority real weight. Labour was organised through the same structure. Temple records list workers by category, from ploughmen and herders to weavers and builders. Rations of grain, oil, and beer were issued based on age, skill, and status. These rations were wages. The system was recorded on clay tablets using early writing. Accounting did not serve curiosity, it served survival. Writing emerged because the temple economy required memory beyond human recall. Storage was another core function. Temple complexes included granaries, warehouses, and sealed rooms designed to protect goods from pests and moisture. Archaeology reveals thick walls and controlled access. These spaces were guarded because they held the city's future. In times of stress, control of stored goods meant control of people. The temple did not need armies to enforce authority. It controlled food. Redistribution reinforced loyalty. Festivals, public rituals, and offerings were moments when stored goods flowed back to the population. Meat, bread, and drink were shared. The god appeared generous. The temple appeared just. These events tied belief to material experience. People did not follow gods only because of fear. They followed because the system worked. Monumental building was part of this economy. Constructing a ziggurat employed hundreds or thousands of workers. Brickmaking, transport, and laying provided steady labor. The temple coordinated materials and schedules. This was economic stimulation as much as devotion. A large building project signaled that the system was healthy and capable of mobilizing surplus. The ziggurat made this organization visible. Its height reflected accumulated labor. Its mass reflected stored resources. Its maintenance reflected long-term planning. Every brick represented time, food, and coordination. Citizens did not need to see tablets to understand this. The building itself was the balance sheet. This visibility mattered politically. Kings ruled through temple systems before they ruled through force. By funding, construction, and restoration, rulers inserted themselves into the flow of resources. They became guarantors of stability. The god sanctioned the king. The king supported the temple. The people received order. Understanding the temple economy explains why ziggurats were built the way they were. They were not tools for unknown functions. They were anchors for known systems. They concentrated belief, labor, and wealth into a single structure that everyone could see and trust. Monumental building was not excess. It was organization turned into architecture, and it kept early cities alive. Building a ziggurat was not an act of mystery, but of logistics, patience, and constant problem solving. These structures were assembled with the most basic materials available, yet required sophisticated planning to survive in a harsh environment. The greatest challenge was not height, it was water. Rain, humidity, and seasonal flooding were the true enemies, and every engineering choice reflects that reality. The process began with brick production. Clay was dug from riverbanks, mixed with water and straw, and shaped into molds. Most bricks were sun-dried, which saved fuel but left them vulnerable to moisture. For critical outer layers, bricks were fired in kilns. Kilns required large amounts of fuel and labor, which meant their use was strategic, not universal. Fired bricks were expensive, so they were placed where protection mattered most. Bitumen played a key role. This natural asphalt seeped from the ground in parts of Mesopotamia and was harvested, heated, and spread between brick layers. Bitumen acted as mortar and waterproofing. It sealed joints, slowed erosion, and bonded fired brick facings to the softer mud brick core. Without it, ziggurats would not have survived even a few decades. Ramps and platforms were essential during construction. There is no evidence of cranes or lifting machines. Instead, builders raised earth ramps as the structure grew, allowing bricks to be carried upward by hand or on sleds. As each level was completed, ramps were extended or reshaped. Once construction ended, these ramps were dismantled, leaving the stepped form visible. Labor was organized at scale. Temple institutions supplied workers, food rations, and tools. Brickmakers, carriers, masons, and supervisors all played defined roles. Work followed seasonal rhythms. Construction slowed during planting and harvest. It intensified when labor was available. This coordination shows administrative strength rather than technological mystery. Drainage was built directly into the structure. Channels were cut through terraces to direct rainwater away from surfaces. Slight slopes ensured water did not pool. These features are simple but effective. Their presence shows builders understood long-term stress and planned for it. Maintenance was assumed from the start. That maintenance never stopped. Ziggurats required constant repair. Outer brick layers cracked. Bitumen dried and failed. Rain penetrated weak points. Kings recorded restoration work not because it was rare, but because it was expected. A neglected ziggurat signaled divine displeasure and political weakness. Keeping it intact was an ongoing obligation. Time reshaped every structure. Many ziggurats were rebuilt multiple times on the same footprint. New layers buried old damage. Height increased slowly through centuries of repair. This explains why ziggurats grew taller without changing function. Growth was cumulative, not revolutionary. Nothing about this process suggests advanced machinery. Every step depends on human labor, simple tools, and environmental awareness. The engineering challenge was endurance, not complexity. Builders fought gravity with mass and fought water with layers. Understanding how these giants were built strips away fantasy and replaces it with respect. The achievement lies in coordination, patience, and persistence. Ziggurats are monuments to human organization under difficult conditions. They survived not because of hidden technology, but because generations kept rebuilding them brick by brick against rain and time itself. Ziggurats do not behave like machines because they were never designed to function as machines. When their materials and construction are examined through basic principles of materials science, the idea of technological signaling collapses quickly. These structures are heavy, porous, and vulnerable. They resist motion, not generate it. Every design choice favors stability over function. The core material of nearly every ziggurat is mud brick. Mud brick is strong under compression, but weak against moisture, vibration, and heat. It absorbs water, swells, cracks, and erodes. For this reason, mud brick buildings require constant protection and repair. Any structure meant to transmit energy, sound, or signals would require materials that resist distortion. Mud brick does the opposite. It dampens vibration and absorbs force. It is a poor conductor of anything except weight. Moisture control dominated ziggurat engineering. Builders added fired brick skins and bitumen layers to slow water damage, not to enhance performance. These layers insulate and seal. Insulation is useful for preservation, but it blocks transmission. A signal tower would require exposure. Ziggurats were wrapped to survive rain. Their very survival depended on isolation from the elements. Metal infrastructure is another absence that matters. Machines require metal parts. Gears, wires, fasteners, or fittings leave traces. Bronze Age Mesopotamia had metal, but it was scarce and valuable. When metal appears archaeologically, it is found in tools, weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects. Ziggurats contain none of the metal frameworks that would be necessary for mechanical function. No brackets, no anchors, no embedded systems. Stone and clay dominate completely. Heat resistance is also telling. Fired bricks appear only on the outer surfaces, not throughout the structure. High temperatures would damage the mud brick core. If sustained fires, engines, or energy sources were present, the structure would fail. Archaeology confirms this. Ziggurats degrade quickly when water penetrates. They are repaired because they are fragile, not because they are powerful. Access patterns reinforce this reality. Stairways are wide and ceremonial, not narrow and functional. They are designed for processions, not technicians. Movement is restricted near the top, not optimized. Machines require regular access. Ziggurats limit it. Their summits are sacred, not operational. Drainage systems further undermine the machine idea. Water channels are shallow and direct. Their purpose is to remove rain, not to circulate anything internally. There are no pipes, conduits, or chambers beneath the surface. Excavations show solid mass, not complexity. A functioning signal tower would leave evidence of adaptation. Repairs would focus on performance. Upgrades would appear. Instead, restorations focus on sealing, resurfacing, and honoring tradition. Kings rebuild the same forms again and again without altering layout. This repetition shows cultural continuity, not technological refinement. Machines evolve, ziggurats do not. Their form stabilizes early and remains consistent for centuries. That consistency makes sense for religious monuments. It makes no sense for devices meant to interact with changing conditions. When material science is applied, the conclusion is unavoidable. Ziggurats are monuments designed to stand still. They absorb, resist, and endure. They do not transmit. They do not process. They do not behave like machines because they were never meant to. Their purpose lies in symbolism, authority, and presence. Expecting them to act otherwise misunderstands both the structures and the people who built them. Anunnaki stands at the center of one of history's most powerful overlaps between archaeology and myth. Its name means foundation of heaven and earth, and it rose in the heart of Babylon as the city's most important sacred monument. Archaeological and textual evidence place its major rebuilding during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before the Common Era, though earlier versions likely existed centuries before. Dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's chief god, Etemenanki was not an isolated tower, but part of a massive temple complex tied directly to state power. According to Babylonian records, Etemenanki was enormous. Estimates based on foundations and later descriptions suggest it rose in multiple step levels and reached a height roughly equal to its base width. Its mass dominated the city skyline. Like other ziggurats, it was built of a mud brick core faced with fired brick and bitumen. Its size required constant repair. Inscriptions describe collapsed sections, water damage, and restoration efforts. This was not a perfect monument. It was a fragile, giant, demanding care. The biblical tradition enters centuries later. In the book of Genesis, a story describes a tower built in a place called Babel, where humans attempted to reach heaven. God responds by confusing their language and scattering them. This story was written down long after Babylon had already risen and fallen multiple times. It reflects memory filtered through theology, not an eyewitness account. Yet it is not pure invention. It draws from the real presence of monumental towers in Mesopotamia that symbolized human ambition and divine authority. Separating archaeology from legend does not mean dismissing either. Archaeology tells us what was built, how, and why. The Bible tells us how later cultures interpreted that legacy. The tower in Genesis is not a technical description. It is a moral story about pride, unity, and limits. The image of humans building upward resonated because real towers existed that seemed to challenge the sky. Etemenanki itself was never meant to be climbed by everyone. Its upper levels were restricted. Its summit housed a shrine, not a platform for observation or ascent. Babylonian texts describe rituals, offerings, and processions. They do not describe attempts to reach heaven physically. The idea of ascent was symbolic. Building high honored Marduk and showed Babylon's dominance, not defiance. The phrase foundation of heaven and earth has often been misunderstood. It did not mean a literal connection between realms. It meant that Babylon claimed to be the center of cosmic order. Marduk ruled the gods. Babylon ruled the cities. Etemenanki expressed that claim in brick. The shadow of Babel grows because later readers brought new fears and ideas to old structures. To some, the tower became a warning, to others a mystery, to still others evidence of lost knowledge. Archaeology grounds these interpretations. It shows continuity with other ziggurats. It shows the same materials, the same problems with water, the same cycles of decay and repair. Anunnaki does not point upward to space. It points inward to human belief. It stands where myth and memory meet stone and clay. Understanding it requires holding both archaeology and tradition in balance. When that balance is kept, the tower loses none of its power. It gains clarity. Mesopotamians watched the sky carefully, but they did not do so from ziggurats in the way modern imagination suggests. Their astronomy was practical, ritual, and deeply tied to timekeeping and omen interpretation. Priests observed the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets to regulate calendars, predict eclipses, and interpret signs believed to reflect divine will. This work did not require towers reaching toward the heavens. It required patience, records, and clear horizons. By the early second millennium before the Common Era, Mesopotamian scholars had developed detailed lunar calendars. Months began with the first visible crescent of the moon. Intercalary months were added to keep seasons aligned. These decisions affected agriculture, festivals, and taxation. Observations were recorded on clay tablets, some of which survive in large numbers. These texts show careful, repeated watching over generations, not dramatic observation from great height. Astronomy and astrology were not separate disciplines. Celestial events were read as messages from the gods. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and unusual phenomena were catalogued because they were believed to signal danger or favour for kings and cities. The famous series known as Enuma Anu Enlil lists thousands of omens connected to sky events. These texts do not describe instruments or elevated platforms. They describe meaning and response. Observations were made from rooftops, courtyards, and open ground. Clear lines of sight mattered more than altitude. In flat Mesopotamia, the horizon was already wide. A few extra meters of height added little advantage. What mattered was continuity. The same place, the same direction, night after night. Consistency produced reliable records. Ziggurats were not designed as observatories. Their summits were occupied by temples and restricted spaces. Access was limited. Ritual schedules did not match nightly observation needs. There is no evidence of sighting markers, alignments, or instruments built into their architecture. No repeated observation platforms, no carved angles or calibrated edges. Nothing that suggests systematic astronomical use. Later cultures built dedicated observatories because their needs changed. Mesopotamians did not separate science from religion. The sky was a text to be read, not a system to be measured mechanically. Their greatest contribution was not telescopes or geometry. It was long-term record-keeping. By comparing centuries of observations, they identified cycles. This knowledge passed through Babylonian scholars to later Greek astronomy. Priests who studied the stars were administrators and theologians. Their authority came from literacy and tradition, not from height. They interpreted signs for kings. They advised on rituals. Their work took place within temple institutions, not above them. The sky was consulted to maintain order on earth. Claims that ziggurats served as astronomical machines misunderstand both the buildings and the practice. The tools of Mesopotamian astronomy were clay tablets, trained memory, and inherited knowledge. Their observatory was time itself. Understanding what they actually did with the sky reveals something more impressive than lost technology. It shows disciplined observation, carried across generations without modern instruments. It shows a culture that mapped time through patience and belief. Ziggurats honored the gods who ruled the sky. They were not needed to study it. The idea of ziggurats as landing pads begins with their flat upper surfaces, which to modernize resemble platforms. This comparison feels natural in an age of helicopters and spacecraft, but it ignores how these spaces were actually used. Flat does not mean functional for landing. In ancient Mesopotamia, flat surfaces were common in architecture because they were easier to build and maintain with mud brick. They provided stable ground for structures, not open space for movement. The top of a ziggurat was not empty. It supported a temple shrine dedicated to the city's patron god. Texts describe these shrines as houses of the god, furnished with altars, offerings, and ritual objects. Archaeology supports this. Foundation deposits, decorative elements, and traces of walls indicate that buildings once stood there. The absence of surviving superstructures is due to erosion and reuse of materials, not original emptiness. Access to these upper levels was carefully controlled. Stairways were narrow near the top and often ended at gates. Only priests and authorized officials could enter the shrine. This restriction mattered. Sacred space was dangerous as well as holy. The god's presence required purity, preparation, and correct ritual behavior. A landing pad would require openness and frequent access. Ziggurat summits offered neither. The surface materials also matter. Upper platforms were paved with brick and coated with bitumen to protect against rain. These surfaces were not reinforced for impact or weight beyond foot traffic and small structures. Mud brick cannot withstand sudden force. Any heavy landing would damage the structure immediately. Builders worked constantly to prevent collapse, not to invite stress. Popular images often remove the shrine entirely, imagining a bare platform open to the sky. This image has no basis in ancient sources. When Mesopotamian texts describe gods descending, they describe them entering the temple, not standing on an open stage. The shrine was the meeting point between divine and human realms. The platform beneath existed to lift that shrine, not to serve as a space on its own. There is also no evidence of markings, symbols, or arrangements that would guide landing or orientation. No lines, no targets, no standardized shapes. Everything about the summit points to ritual enclosure rather than open use. Orientation mattered for temples, but it was symbolic, aligned with gods and cities, not with navigation. The landing pad idea survives because it removes context. When the shrine is ignored and access rules are forgotten, the platform looks mysterious. Restoring those details removes the mystery. Ziggurats were crowded with meaning, not empty space. Understanding what stood on top clarifies the entire structure. The highest point was the most restricted, the most sacred, and the least accessible. That is the opposite of how landing areas function. The flat top was not an invitation, it was a boundary. The god's house stood there, elevated above the city, reminding everyone below that some spaces were meant to be approached only through ritual, not descent from the sky. This meaning is consistent across sites and centuries' use. If ziggurats were built as signal towers, archaeology would reveal clear physical signatures of that function. Long-range signaling requires repetition, standardization, and infrastructure that supports transmission. Whether the method involved fire, sound, light, or some unknown system, it would leave traces. These traces are not subtle. They appear in places designed for use, wear, and repair. When we ask what we would expect to find, the answer is concrete. First, we would expect evidence of sustained activity at the summit. Signal towers require regular access. Paths would be worn smooth. Stairways would show heavy traffic. Platforms would carry marks of use. Excavations at Ziggurats show the opposite. Upper levels were restricted, lightly used, and ritually controlled. Wear patterns match ceremonial movement, not constant operation. Second, we would expect residues. Fire signaling leaves ash, charcoal, and burned surfaces. Sound signaling leaves mounting points for instruments. Light signaling leaves fixtures or reflective materials. Archaeologists have found none of these. Ziggurat summits yield foundation deposits, offering remains and architectural fragments from shrines. The material record reflects worship, not signaling. Third, we would expect networks. A signal tower is only useful if it connects to others. That means alignment across landscapes, consistent spacing, and visibility planning. Ziggurats do not form such networks. They are clustered in cities, not placed along routes or borders. Their orientations follow religious tradition, not lines of sight between sites. Fourth, we would expect adaptation over time. Functional systems evolve. Builders improve efficiency, add features, and modify layouts. Ziggurats remain remarkably consistent for centuries. Rebuilding restores earlier forms, rather than altering them. The goal is continuity, not improvement. That behavior fits ritual monuments, not technical infrastructure. Fifth, we would expect textual support. Ancient Mesopotamians recorded what mattered to them. They documented omens, rations, laws, and repairs. If signaling systems existed, they would appear in texts describing operation, failure, or ritual importance. No such texts exist. References to ziggurats focus on gods, kings, and restoration. Excavations provide the final comparison. When archaeologists dig, they uncover solid mud brick cores, drainage channels, stairways, and temple remains. They do not uncover cavities, conduits, metal frameworks, or specialized installations. The absence is consistent across sites and periods. It is not a matter of missing evidence, it is a pattern. Asking what we would find if ziggurats were signal towers sharpens the question. The expected evidence is well understood. It is simply not there. Instead, every excavation reinforces the same conclusion. These structures were designed to stand, not to operate. The signal tower idea survives because it is rarely tested against physical reality. When it is, it fails quietly. The ground tells a different story than speculation. Bricks, wear, placement, and records all point in the same direction. Ziggurats communicated meaning through presence and scale. They did not transmit messages across distance. The archaeology is clear, consistent, and complete. That clarity remains unchanged by new digs, new theories, or shifting trends in popular speculation today. The evidence continues to accumulate with every careful excavation conducted. The Anunnaki astronaut idea did not come from ancient tablets. It emerged in the 20th century, shaped by modern fears, hopes, and fascination with space. After the Second World War, technology advanced rapidly. Rockets, satellites, and nuclear power changed how humans imagined the universe. Space became reachable, and with that shift came a new question. If humans could leave Earth, perhaps someone else had done so before. Ancient history was re-examined through that lens. During the 1950s and 1960s, popular writers began presenting speculative interpretations of ancient texts. These works were not produced by trained Assyriologists or archaeologists. They often relied on partial translations, outdated sources, or secondary summaries rather than original cuneiform tablets. Complex mythological language was treated as literal description. Metaphor became machinery. Poetry became reportage. One common method was mistranslation by simplification. Sumerian and Akkadian are difficult languages, rich in symbolic meaning. Words can carry multiple senses depending on context. Pseudo-archaeological writers often selected the most dramatic meaning and ignored the rest. Terms related to heaven, light, or descent were read physically rather than cosmologically. This stripped the texts of their cultural framework. Another factor was the blending of different traditions into a single narrative. Myths from Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and later cultures were merged as if they described one consistent story. Differences in time, place, and purpose were flattened. Gods who served different roles across centuries were treated as the same beings with the same intentions. This created a false sense of continuity that made the astronaut idea seem stronger than it was. The Cold War also shaped these interpretations. Anxiety about power, destruction, and outside control made the idea of ancient overseers appealing. Aliens replaced gods as authority figures because modern audiences trusted technology more than religion. The Anunnaki were recast as engineers because engineering was the new symbol of power. Publishing played a role as well. Sensational claims sold books. Careful scholarship did not. Titles promising hidden knowledge and lost civilizations reached far larger audiences than academic journals. Over time, repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created belief. The idea became cultural background noise rather than a claim needing proof. Importantly, scholars responded early and often. Assyriologists pointed out errors. Archaeologists published detailed rebuttals. But academic writing moves slowly and avoids spectacle. It rarely reaches mass audiences. This imbalance allowed unsupported ideas to spread unchecked. The Anunnaki astronaut theory also benefited from visual media. Illustrations, documentaries, and later internet videos reinforced the narrative with imagery that felt convincing. Ancient art was cropped or isolated from context. Symbols were redrawn to resemble modern objects. Once seen, these images were hard to forget, even when explanations followed. Understanding why this idea appeared does not require assuming deception. It requires recognizing how modern expectations shape interpretation. 20th century culture was obsessed with progress, contact, and the unknown. Ancient myths were repurposed to reflect those interests. When context is restored, the astronaut narrative dissolves. The texts return to what they are. Religious literature explaining order, authority, and survival in an unpredictable world. The Anunnaki did not change. The audience did. Claims about Anunnaki technology often rely on a small set of images and objects that are repeatedly presented as proof. These include carved icons, cylinder seals, star symbols, and shapes said to resemble rockets or astronauts. When examined in isolation, these images can seem strange. When examined in context, their meanings are consistent, documented, and human. Cylinder seals are among the most misused artifacts. These small carved stones were rolled over wet clay to leave an impression. They functioned like signatures, and scenes often combined gods, worshippers, animals, and symbols. Many seals show figures wearing horned crowns, which modern viewers sometimes interpret as helmets. In Mesopotamian art, horned crowns are a standard sign of divinity. They do not indicate equipment. They indicate status. Star symbols are another common focus. Stars appear frequently in Mesopotamian art and writing because the sky played a major role in religion. A star could represent a god, especially Ishtar, or divine presence more generally. It could also mark something sacred. These symbols are not maps or coordinates, they are shorthand. Ancient viewers understood them immediately because they shared the same symbolic language. Some seals show figures emerging from objects or standing near shapes described as rockets. In reality, these are often stylized altars, ritual stands, or representations of sacred mountains. Artistic conventions were not realistic, proportions were symbolic, important figures were larger, sacred objects were emphasized. Reading these images as technical diagrams misunderstands how ancient art works. Another frequently cited example is the so-called astronaut figure. This usually refers to a robed figure with a rounded head or large eyes. In Mesopotamian sculpture, clothing and posture signaled role, not anatomy. Wide eyes represented alertness or divine awareness. Rounded shapes resulted from carving style and material limits. There is no depiction of breathing apparatus, tools, or movement associated with machinery. Context is what changes interpretation. Archaeologists do not study images alone. They study where they are found, what objects surround them, and what texts accompany them. When seals are found in administrative buildings, their imagery reflects authority and legitimacy. When found in graves, it reflects protection and belief. No seal has ever been found alongside evidence of technology. Text and image reinforce each other. When a symbol appears in art, its meaning is usually explained somewhere in writing. Mesopotamia left tens of thousands of tablets. If an image represented advanced devices, that idea would surface in texts. It does not. Instead, the same gods, myths, and rituals appear again and again. Misuse often involves removing scale. Enlarged images distort proportions. Cropped images remove surrounding figures that clarify meaning. Redrawing artifacts introduces modern shapes that were never present. Once altered, the image becomes evidence of itself rather than of the past. Mainstream interpretations are not guesses. They are built from comparison across hundreds of sites and thousands of objects. Patterns repeat, meanings stabilize. Disagreements exist, but they stay within cultural boundaries. No credible interpretation places advanced technology into these scenes. The appeal of misused evidence lies in surprise. Familiar shapes trigger modern associations. The mind fills gaps quickly. Scholarship slows that process by restoring context. When that context is restored, the images stop pointing outward to space. They point inward to belief, hierarchy, and myth. These objects are not failed machines or forgotten tools. They are successful symbols. They worked because people understood them. Treating them as evidence of astronauts does not uncover hidden truth. It hides the real one, which is how ancient societies expressed meaning using art that spoke clearly to those who lived among it. Serious scholars do argue about ziggurats, but their debates look very different from popular speculation. The disagreements focus on details of ritual use, regional variation, and how much we can safely reconstruct from damaged remains. These debates are careful, limited by evidence, and grounded in context. They do not question whether ziggurats were religious monuments. They explore how those monuments functioned within different cities and periods. One area of debate concerns ritual activity on upper levels. While it is clear that a shrine stood at the summit, scholars discuss how often rituals occurred there and what kinds of offerings were typical. Some argue for frequent ceremonial use tied to festivals. Others suggest that access was rare and highly restricted. The evidence comes from texts, wear patterns, and comparative practices, not speculation. Reconstruction is another challenge. Many ziggurats survive only as eroded cores. Upper temples are often gone. Archaeologists must rely on foundations, debris, and later descriptions. This creates uncertainty about exact height, number of levels, and decorative details. Scholars debate these points openly, presenting multiple models rather than claiming certainty. This is normal scientific caution. Regional variation matters as well. Ziggurats in southern Mesopotamia differ from those in the north. Climate, available materials, and local religious traditions shaped design. Some were taller. Some were broader. Some emphasized stairways differently. These differences help scholars trace cultural exchange and political influence. They do not suggest different functions. There is also discussion about symbolism. Scholars ask what specific meanings ziggurats held for ordinary people versus elites. Did farmers see them mainly as sacred mountains or as storehouses of power? Did kings emphasize different messages than priests? These questions explore perception, not hidden technology. Chronology is debated too. Dating construction phases relies on inscriptions, pottery, and stratigraphy. When dates shift by decades or centuries, interpretations adjust. This can change how a ziggurat fits into political history. It does not change what the structure was. Importantly, scholars revise conclusions when new evidence appears. Excavations add data. Improved translations clarify texts. This process strengthens understanding over time. It does not chase mystery, it reduces it. What scholars do not argue about is just as important. There is no debate about ziggurats being machines, signal towers, or alien platforms. Those ideas do not appear in academic discussion because they lack supporting evidence. Silence here is not suppression. It is the result of consensus. Honest history allows uncertainty. It admits what is unknown. It avoids filling gaps with imagination. The study of ziggurats remains active because they are complex human creations. Their builders balanced belief, labor, and environment. Understanding that balance takes patience. Nuance does not weaken the story. It makes it stronger. When scholars argue, they argue within reality. Their debates show respect for the evidence and for the people who built these monuments. That respect is what keeps the investigation grounded and trustworthy. This approach keeps the field rigorous and alive across many generations of study. It also keeps conclusions responsibly, limited, firmly grounded today here. The most convincing explanation for ziggurats does not reduce their power, it restores it. These structures were sacred mountains built by human societies that learned how to organize belief, labor, and resources at an extraordinary scale. No hidden technology is required to explain them. What is required is respect for what early civilizations achieved with limited tools and immense coordination. Ziggurats answered a deep human need. Mesopotamia was flat, unstable, and dangerous. Floods destroyed fields. Droughts followed. Cities needed symbols of order that rose above uncertainty. The sacred mountain idea met that need. By lifting the god above the city, people created a visible center that promised stability. The height mattered because it reassured. The mass mattered because it endured. These buildings also functioned as civic propaganda in the clearest sense of the word. They proclaimed that the city was favored by the gods and capable of mobilizing surplus. Every brick represented labor fed and organized by the temple system. Every terrace announced that the city could plan beyond survival. This was not deception, it was communication. Ziggurats told residents and visitors alike that this place worked. Temple-centered organization made this possible. Temples managed land, stored grain, employed workers, recorded transactions, and redistributed resources. Ziggurats stood above these systems as their symbol and anchor. They were not separate from daily life. They shaped it. Festivals, rituals, and processions tied the population emotionally to the structure. Belief and economy reinforced each other. Kings understood this power and invested in it. When rulers rebuilt ziggurats, they were not chasing mystery. They were renewing legitimacy. Inscriptions say this plainly. The king restored the house of the god. The god granted favor. The city prospered. This cycle appears again and again across centuries. It does not require reinterpretation. It requires reading. The astonishing part is not hidden technology. It is continuity. Ziggurats were maintained, rebuilt, and revered for more than 1,000 years. Generations participated in their upkeep. Knowledge passed down. Rituals adapted. Cities rose and fell, but the form endured. That persistence speaks to shared meaning strong enough to survive political collapse. Human ingenuity shines here. Without steel, without machines, without modern math, builders created structures that dominated landscapes and memory. They solved problems of drainage, weight, and labor organization through experience and tradition. They learned what worked and repeated it. That learning is visible in brick and bitumen. Removing aliens does not make the story smaller. It makes it larger. It credits ancient people with intelligence, rather than treating them as passive recipients of outside help. It recognizes that myth, belief, and organization can drive achievements as powerful as any machine. Ziggurats were not mistakes or misunderstandings. They were successful answers to real needs. They held cities together. They structured time and ritual. They gave people a way to imagine order in a world that often lacked it. The human answer is enough. It is more than enough. It shows that long before modern technology, societies could shape landscapes and thought at the same time. Ziggurats stand as proof that humans did not need visitors from the stars to build wonders. They needed belief, cooperation, and the will to build upward together. At dawn, on the Mesopotamian plain, the ziggurat rose, as it always had, silent, massive, and unavoidable. It did not wait for an answer from the sky. It spoke downward. To farmers, traders, priests, and kings, it delivered a single message: order exists, and it is guarded by divine authority. This was the real signal. Height organized belief, scale enforced memory. The tower marked the center of the city and the center of meaning. Anyone who entered the streets knew where power lived and why obedience mattered within daily life, rituals, seasons, and survival itself, for every household and generation. Ziggurats framed the world. Above was divine authority. Below was human labor. Between them stood ritual law and responsibility. The building made that structure visible, so no explanation was required, and no doubt was permitted within daily movement, prayer, taxation, work, harvest, festival, justice, kingship, and memory shared by all. Every choice in their construction reinforced this message. The slow climb, the restricted summit, the hidden shrine, all taught restraint and hierarchy. Access was earned, not taken, and power was elevated beyond casual reach through ritual purity, training, tradition, silence, patience, and repetition across generations of cities and peoples alike. No machinery was needed to transmit this meaning. It traveled through sight habit and shared belief. The ziggurat worked because people understood it. and acted accordingly day after day, year after year, across floods, droughts, wars, rebuilding, loss, renewal, memory, fear, hope, order, faith, obligation, authority, survival, together, always. Present. When later ages forgot this language, they searched for new explanations. Towers became puzzles instead of statements. Speculation filled gaps, left by distance from the culture that built them, and by modern desires for mystery, power, contact, rescue, and spectacle beyond human history itself, repeatedly imagined again and again today. Archaeology brings the message back into focus. Bricks, inscriptions, layouts, and wear patterns agree. They tell the same story without drama or disguise, rooted in labor, ritual, economy, belief, environment, time, authority, survival, memory, repetition, continuity, restoration, devotion, planning, coordination, discipline, patience, tradition, evidence, accumulated slowly and openly by scholars. Ziggurats did not reach for the stars. They anchored heaven to earth in the only way ancient cities could, through ritual order and shared meaning expressed by stone-height procession, offering calendar law, kingship, work, distribution, storage, memory, obligation, protection, identity, belonging, fear, hope, endurance, stability, balance, purpose, continuity, together. The final signal was never aimed outward. It was aimed inward, shaping how people lived, worked, feared, and hoped beneath its shadow. Every morning, every season, every flood, every decree, every prayer, every tax, every harvest, every loss, every rebuilding cycle, until the city itself changed or vanished from memory. That broadcast still works today if we listen carefully. The ziggurat tells us who ruled, who protected, and how meaning was built long before machines could speak through stone labor, belief, organization, cooperation, imagination, discipline, tradition, authority, community, resilience, adaptation, patience, context, evidence, respect, history, humanity itself, clearly, plainly, enduringly.